Hello everyone, this video is a cutout segment from this other video that I made recently, and I have tried my best to edit it to make it a more standalone experience, but if I do say something that sounds kind of awkward, that's why. This video will also contain spoilers of varying severity for most of the games in the series, and I recommend that you watch it only after beating all the games. So anyways, I want to keep this intro short, so hope you enjoy the Yakuza 3 analysis. I have a pretty short history with the Yakuza series, now known as Like a Dragon, but despite that, I have been obsessed with it. Since starting the series with Zero in March 2022, I have played every game in the series, including every numbered mainline entry, Gaiden, the original PS2 games, the Judgments, the Kurohyou games, Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise, Dead Souls, Kinzen, and both versions of Ishin. I have dumped thousands of hours combined into all of these games, and I don't regret a second of it, but out of all of them, Yakuza 3 is the one that stands out to me the most. It's considered by many to be the weakest entry in the franchise, due to its seemingly bugged combat in which enemies are way too defensive and block most of your attacks, and for some story beats, which we will get to shortly. As for the combat, I'm somewhere in the middle of the conversation. Some of Yakuza 3's staunch defenders will say that the blocking is just a skill issue and that you should just grab and stop mashing, while the haters say that it ruins the game and is impossible to deal with. For me, I think that the defenders undersell how the blocking changes the way you play the game, mostly negatively, but I also think that the haters are neglecting the numerous workarounds that exist. Overall, I like Yakuza 3's combat, but understand that it's much better on New Game Plus because you have more tools to deal with the blocking. With that said, let me begin the story analysis at Chapter 1. Yakuza 3's introductory cutscene is interesting, because, unlike the previous two entries, it takes place in the middle of the game. Yakuza 1 starts with Kiryu and Shinji making their way to Peace Finance for a collection, and Yakuza 2 shows the Jingwon Massacre, an event which takes place over 20 years before the game's main story. Yakuza 1 starts in the present, Yakuza 2 in the past, and now Yakuza 3 in the future. Just something I thought was neat. Anyhow, this cutscene introduces us to Kiryu's orphans, which hadn't existed prior to this game, and some of the new characters, like Rikiya and the for now unnamed boss. This boss, as Rikiya tells Kiryu, has been shot. The scene then cuts to Daigo Dojima, the chairman of the Tojo clan. Starting the game by seeing Daigo as chairman is a great move, as it opens the door for many possibilities with his newfound leadership. I really like the direction they settle on too, as when Daigo returns to Tojo HQ for a meeting concerning a deal in Okinawa, he's met by someone who looks exactly like Shintaro Kazuma, Kiryu's dead adoptive father, who was also captain of the Tojo for a short time. This Kazuma lookalike doesn't spend much time with greetings and gets straight to business. He somehow got his hands on the deed to Kiryu's orphanage, which Daigo has been very vocal about not touching. The lookalike stresses that the Tojo cannot refuse whatever deal is associated with the land, but Daigo stands his ground. In response, the lookalike reaches into his breast pocket. Daigo hurriedly reaches for his own gun, and flashing over to Kiryu and his gang in the hospital, the little girl by the name of Saki shows him a drawing of the man who shot the boss, now said to be named Nakahara. Kiryu is taken aback as this drawing depicts the exact same Kazuma lookalike that shot Daigo. I don't normally like spending long stretches just summarizing stuff that happens, but I wanted to emphasize just how strong of an opening this is. It sets up the conflict of the Okinawa land deal, and the mystery intertwined with it of how a dead man suddenly shows back up years later. It seamlessly introduces the updated situations of the characters, with Daigo's tenure as chairman now being in full swing, and Kiryu now owning an orphanage. It leaves you wondering just who these new people in Kiryu's life are and what happened to Daigo after getting shot. It's a great intro to a great game. Chapter 1 proper begins in the cemetery 1 month after the events of Yakuza 2. The game uses this as a clever way to refresh your memory of the events and characters from the previous two games. Kiryu says his goodbyes to Sayama, don't worry she's irrelevant to this game, and the rest of this segment basically serves as an epilogue to Yakuza 2. Several goodbyes and combat tutorials later, you meet up with Majima on the roof of the Millennium Tower. For those not in the know, Goro Majima is a recurring character in the Yakuza series and longtime friend of Kiryu's. He plays a large role in almost every game, and was even a playable protagonist in Zero, and Dead Souls if you know you know. The main reason for their meetup is for Kiryu to ask Majima to look after Daigo while he's in Okinawa. This scene is the first of many examples of this game's main theme. The overall theme of the Yakuza series is how, even in the worst of places, you can still find humanity. It does this by utilizing the Yakuza, a real collection of organized crime outfits. While the Yakuza are certainly an evil group, both in real life and in the games, the Yakuza series shows that even amongst such a despicable organization, there are still genuinely good people to be found. Each entry in the series uses different avenues to explore this topic. For example, Yakuza 5 rather infamously uses the idea of dreams to propagate this theme. It shows how dreams contribute to one's legacy, and how you can still find meaning in your life even if you aren't able to achieve your dream. Conversely, it also shows how chasing a dream too hard can hurt you and those you care about, and how it can warp into an endless quest for power. The main idea of Yakuza 3 is challenging the definition of family, and more specifically, the definition of fatherhood. This one scene with Majima is a very mild example of Kiryu and Daigo's unconventional father-son relationship. This relationship in particular is only slightly touched upon in Yakuza 3, as it's a series-spanning one that develops from Yakuza 2 all the way to Yakuza 6, with some retroactive context in Zero, and some further tidbits in Yakuza 7, Gaiden, as well as most likely in Yakuza 8, which is not out yet as of the time of me writing this script. Aside from all of that, Majima is the first boss fight in the game. Yakuza 3 really innovates by having you start the game with a rooftop shirtless beatdown instead of just ending with it. This fight isn't all that special though, it's a watered down version of the Majima fight later in the game, and that one's way better. It's still a really solid first fight though. The blocking problem this game has doesn't really apply to bosses, which is a huge plus. I think this game has overall fantastic boss design, which is something I feel is overlooked when talking about Yakuza 3. I won't be talking about it here as Majima's first fight isn't a super great example, but for the other bosses, I will be stating my thoughts on how they are designed. For some closing thoughts on this chapter, I do like that we get a cutscene of just Kiryu and Majima chilling for once. Rarely do we ever get to see them hang out as friends, so props to Yakuza 3 for that. The PS3 trilogy of Yakuza games tried to give Majima a lot more depth to his character, and I think they succeeded. I'm not huge on how he was basically reduced to a plot device in Yakuza 5, and while that's also true to a far lesser extent in 4, he had a lot more plot relevance because of the Ueno Seiwa massacre. I think Yakuza 3 strikes a good balance of giving him a lot more to do in the story while also keeping the original spirit of his character alive. Chapter 2 fast-forwards 6 months into the summer of 2007. We're back to Kiryu in his orphanage as he's about to sit down with his kids for dinner. One of the children, Izumi, is mysteriously absent from the table, so Kiryu goes to look for her. This is the first of many sections of the game which revolve around the kids in the orphanage. One of the biggest complaints that people have about this game is that the orphanage stuff takes up way too much of an already short game, and takes away from the actual Yakuza plotline, not to mention the segments generally being just plain boring. I do agree that the standard Yakuza-centered story could have used some extra runtime, especially considering the notoriously bad and drawn-out plot dumping scene later in the game. But I don't think the orphanage stuff is the worst thing in the world. It definitely needed some of the fat trimmed off, and could have used some extra stuff to make it a little more interesting, but I don't consider it to be the spawn of Satan in the way that Yakuza 3's most vocal detractors make it out to be. Luckily, this first orphanage segment is very short and doesn't overstay its welcome, and it does a good job of laying out the groundwork for the game's themes of family. The most upfront way in which it does this is by affirming that Kiryu and the orphans are a family, and that it doesn't matter that these children lack their biological parents. For context, Izumi has confessed that she's being bullied by kids at her school for being an orphan. While this seems out of the ordinary to someone like me, who lives in the United States, as well as to those in other Western countries, children in the foster care system in Japan have it pretty rough, and face large amounts of discrimination for their orphan status. The Yakuza series has always been known to be politically progressive when it comes to the treatment of marginalized groups, such as the homeless, sex workers, and now orphans. Even disregarding the political aspects, it's nice to see this game challenge traditional family structures in this way. In this regard, Yakuza 3 was ahead of its time. As time goes on, long-standing definitions of family are being put into question more and more. And this is not the first time that Yakuza 3 will give its 2 cents on that topic. The game does another time skip into March of 2008, where Haruka gives Kiryu an eviction notice, which is implied to be from the 2 men sitting in their truck out front. These are the 2 guys we saw accompanying Kiryu in the intro cutscene, and that messes with things a bit. We know that these 2 eventually come around to be Kiryu's friends, which takes away from the mysterious allure of the eviction notice. But at the same time, We also know that something must have happened to make them join the good side. There's still a mystery as to what their deal is, but in setting up another mystery, it takes away from the mysteriousness of this mystery. I am a good writer. The two guys drive away as Kiryu tries to confront them, so he needs to go track them down. He finds them eating popsicles in Ryukyu. They try to appear menacing, but fail miserably. The guy in the floral shirt says that for the exact reason why they're trying to evict Kiryu, he needs to go ask their boss. Kiryu, comedically, just walks away. The guy stops Kiryu and challenges him to a fight. As funny as this scene is, it's also an early example of Kiryu's past coming to haunt him. This is something that is more central to the plots of later games, but Yakuza 3 started that motif. Seen here by the Ryudo captain accusing him of being a Yakuza because of the tattoo on his back. As for the fight itself, it's okay. It's pretty easy on New Game Plus once you have Kamaki Parry unlocked and know the timing for the attack he does after this little shuffle. It's a pretty annoying fight on New Game though, but Rikiya, as we now know him, only has one health bar anyway. Rikiya, accepting defeat, agrees to take Kiryu to the Ryudo office. Kiryu sits down and waits for Nakahara, the Ryudo boss, and sees a little girl, who's drawing. Nakahara says that she's his adoptive daughter, and that her name is Saki. She'll be important later. Nakahara tells Kiryu that they're trying to evict him as part of a plan to build a resort on the property. Even with promises of money, Kiryu refuses to budge. Nakahara pulls a sword on Kiryu, but he manages to talk him down, asking him where his kids would go if he were to kill him. I like this scene because it shows you that the Ryudo are different from the other mindlessly evil Yakuza families that Kiryu has met in the past. It shows that Nakahara and his boy still have humanity in them, and the upcoming chapters build on that thought. Chapter 3 begins with a news report on the resort deal that Nakahara mentioned. At this point, you can probably connect the dots that the resort deal is the same one that Daigo refused to partake in. The report shows that the deal is actually a political struggle between two politicians, Yoshinobu Suzuki, who supports the resort deal, and Ryuzo Tamiya, who wishes to build an American military base instead. The game makes it a point to show Suzuki as this lovable man of the people, and Tamiya as a conceited, self-absorbed money grubber. After the news report is another orphanage section, this time with Shido. He's been getting bullied, but hasn't been able to say anything about it because the bully threatened to tell his dad, who has connections to city officials who can shut down Morning Glory, the name of the orphanage. This all serves as an elaborate excuse to introduce the golf minigame, where you play with that same city official that the bully's dad threatened to call. The official heads to Morning Glory, the bully and his dad show up to complain, the bully makes a fool of himself, and the whole situation gets resolved. This one's pretty inoffensive. The only thing it really does is shake up the gameplay a bit, and further shows the troubles of Japanese orphans, but it gives little insight into Kiryu and Shido's relationship otherwise. Another one starts immediately after, and you're tasked with finding out what happened to Ayako's allowance. You round up everyone at the dinner table, but still aren't able to figure out what happened to it. On the way out, you find Eri quickly running out of the room after doing something to Ayako's bag. Turns out, she put all of the money back in there. And when you go to confront her on the beach, it turns out that she took the money because she promised that she'd go see a movie with her friends. This side story is similarly just fine. These short sidetracks, while combining to make something great, are largely uninteresting in isolation, which is why I think most people don't like them. I don't even blame them for this. Not everyone is obsessed with the bigger picture of my 2009 PS3 game about sweaty, half-naked men punching each other. But at the end of the day, I still like the inclusion of these side stories, even if I do wish they were handled a little better. At least with this second one, we get a really sweet cutscene at the end of it. Keep this line in mind for later. Rikiya shows back up and says that he needs a favor from Kiryu. He explains that Saki disappeared a few days ago, and they haven't been able to find her despite their tireless efforts. He says that they can't go to the police about it because Nakahara never officially adopted Saki. He took her in after running a collection on her dad. When he walked in, he was hanging, with Saki still clutching to his leg. Saki's biological mother, described as having a tendency to sleep around and having next to no care for her daughter, is reportedly trying to get her hands on her again. Rikiya says that Saki can't contact them due to her inability to speak, a psychological reaction to seeing her dad's suicide, which is also the reason why she communicates using the sketchbook. Kiryu goes to talk some sense into a now completely wasted Nakahara, who believes that Saki ran away to be with her mother instead of him. He puts himself down by saying that, as a Yakuza, he has no right to be a father. I know I'm plot rambling again, but trust me, I will come back around to this soon. Kiryu and Rikiya eventually find out that Saki is being held in the Tamashiro family office, an Okinawa-based branch of the Tojo. This starts off the first long battle of the game. For those unfamiliar with the Yakuza series, long battles are lengthy combat sections which involve you traversing through a large area. Essentially, they're like levels in other games. This one is alright. It's not blowing any minds, but it's fun. A solid B tier, I'd say. The real problem with Yakuza 3's long battles is the amount of them. Every other Yakuza game has 6 to 8 long battles. Yakuza 3 has 4. Now, that's not totally a bad thing as long as the long battles are of good quality, but starting out with a mere decent one isn't the greatest sign. One good thing I can say though is that Illtreatment, the long battle theme, is a banger. The long battle ends with Kiryu making his way into Tamashito's office, where he finds Tamashito himself, along with Saki and her mother. The situation quickly becomes clear, as Tamashito says that Saki's mother kidnapped her due to their affair. Saki's mother exclaims that he promised they could be a family. This was, of course, all a lie so that Tamashito could get leverage over the Ryudo family. This pisses Kiryu off, and he begins the fight with Tamashito. Tamashito is a two-phase boss. He starts out with a fast and defensive knife moveset, before going into heat mode and pulling out some knuckles. Phase 1 Tamashito is very dodgy and loves to block. He's very much an exception to the bosses not blocking as much as normal enemies, but this is by design. He's very defensive in this phase, and you're intended to catch him when his guard's down. Tamashito is the first boss in the game with a good wall-less corner that allows you to do some knockdown combos. This, of course, includes the infinite, but I won't be abusing that. This more so applies to his first phase though, as he gains knockdown immunity in his second phase. This is not to say that it's impossible, however. There are some weird workarounds, such as attacking as soon as you land a parry or pick him up off the ground. For some reason, enemies will immediately be sent into a knockdown state, although the window is very small, especially for picking an enemy up. This also happens when you break out of an enemy's grab, which has a much more generous window, but this doesn't apply for Tamashito as he does not grab you. Tamashito is a lot more aggressive in his second phase, but his attacks are also a lot slower, which allow for many more parry opportunities, or if you're crazy like me, tiger drops from behind. After beating Tamashito, Rikiya and Nakahara bust in, and I'm not even gonna beat around the bush. This is my favorite scene in the entire game, and honestly in the entire series as well. I don't want to spoil the moment with my commentary, so have a look for yourself.
Nakahara の親父さんな、お前がいなくなってすごく心配していたんだ。お前がな、本当の母親のとこに行っちゃったんじゃないかと思ってすごく寂しがっていたんだ。お前は中原と母親どっちと一緒にいたいんだ。
何が娘よ、何が母親よ。バカじゃないのあんたたち。
何？
私はね、この子のせいで人生めちゃくちゃになったのよ。生まれた時からいっつも邪魔だった。
この浜、王将の前でなんてこと。
うるさい、私に触らないで。そんなにその子が欲しいんならあんたにくれてやるわ。
くそ、なんて母親だ。実の子の目の前で。これじゃあ先があんまりにも。
先なら大丈夫だ。スケッチブックの中身見たことないだろう。
ああ、
見てみろ。
いつも見守ってくれてありがとう。
もう答えは出ていたんだ。サキはあんたの本当の娘なんだ。そうだろ、サキ。
サキありがとうな。 ありがとうな。酒。
It's difficult to put the beauty of this scene and how much I resonate with it into words. It employs the classic filmmaking technique of showing rather than telling via someone physically unable to tell. I understand that I just implied that a cutscene in Yaoi Simulator 2009 is film, but I digress. I want to save my personal connections to this game as a whole for after the story analysis, but I can't help but explain the sheer artistry of this scene and how it makes me feel. I grew up with an abusive father, and I'm still dealing with the lasting effects of his abuse to this day. Even after I was finally able to leave his household, that part of my family still pressured me to keep in contact with him and pretend as if nothing happened. Now, I'm only 17 years old, so for essentially my whole life, I've been told that I have to love him as family even if my own heart told me otherwise. Even worse, I played this game when I was 15, right after I stopped living with him. Needless to say, I was conflicted and seriously doubted if it was right to want to cut him out of my life. Then, this scene comes along, looks me dead in the eyes, and somehow, without words, sternly tells me, blood relation is meaningless. You decide who you consider family. Now, I don't want to dwell on the heavy stuff for too long just yet, so I'd like to wrap back around to the previous section with Nakahara. He considered himself unfit to be Saki's father because he's a Yakuza, so this scene serves as a wake-up call for him just as much as it did for me. Kiryu even interrupts him during that conversation to tell him that he was an orphan under the care of a Yakuza. In all of the ways that this game explores family and fatherhood, this might be my favorite, although I am biased. Anyways, after the events that transpired that day, Nakahara begs Kiryu to swear an oath of brotherhood with him out of respect. Out of nowhere, Daigo comes in. Remember, this is before he got shot. He reveals that Minister Suzuki, the politician backing the resort deal, was working with the Tamashiro family to acquire land, and that the Tamashiro had abducted Sake to get their hands on the deed to Kiryu's land. The resort and the military base are more connected than we thought, apparently. Daigo assures Kiryu that despite all of this political messiness, he will try his best to make sure the orphanage is untouched. Toma is also here. He's a politician who works under Tamiya, the guy backing the military base. He doesn't have too much importance right now, but he'll pop back up later. I like the conclusion of this scene as it really shows the growing relationship between Kiryu and Daigo. Daigo has a very sincere and deep respect for Kiryu, and speaks with him in the way that a son would to his father. Like I said, the unorthodox familial bond of theirs isn't fully fleshed out in this game, but it's still nice to see regardless. I want to take a short break to warn you that chapters 4 to 9 are pretty light on the analysis. A lot of the strong theming and symbolism take a back seat while the plot does its thing during the middle section of the game. This is not to say that the middle part of the game is bad, but I have significantly less to talk about during this portion. When it comes to a review of the game like this, where I'm more so talking about why the game works for me, rather than how objectively good I think the game is, it's somewhat difficult to make good points during a segment where the game drops most of its messaging for more plot development. I'll still make time to talk about the things I do find important enough to cover, but those will be fewer and farther between. We finally come full circle in Chapter 4, where we start right after the intro cutscene ended in March 2009. Kashiwagi, the current leader of the Kazuma family, calls Kiryu to alert him of Daigo's shooting at the hands of the Kazuma lookalike. The doctor gives an update on Nakahara's condition, and we cut to Kiryu on the beach. He's planning to head to Kamurocho the next day to get to the bottom of things. Rikiya begs him to tag along, and Kiryu accepts. But before we get to Kamurocho, we have more orphanage side quests to do. Chapter 4 is where I feel like they really jump the shark and overstay their welcome. The first one is about the kids finding a dog. Izumi really wants to keep it because it reminds her of her old dog, so we have to go on a wild goose chase. First by literally chasing the dog around Ryukyu, then by going and buying some dog food, then going all the way back to Morning Glory for a ball, and finally fucking off and doing something else until the game says you can progress. The dog finally decides to listen and you go home. The end. This one's pretty bad and nothing more than a mindless fetch quest, but still pales in comparison to the steaming termite mound of shit that is the next one. Rikiya points your attention towards Mitsuo, who apparently has a crush on Ryona. She rejects his offer to go to the movies, and you have to go buy some clothes to improve his drip. He tries again and gets super rejected. Kiryu overhears Ryona talking to Haruka. She says she hates black people and gets rejected by her crush for being a burn victim. And then she and Mitsuo make up. This is a huge oversimplification, but one, I don't think that a child being racist is the greatest plot point in the world. Bit of an editor's note, I understand what they were going for here. They're making a connection between Leona not liking Mitsuo because he's black, and her crush not liking her because of her burn scar. Still, I don't think this was handled in a great fashion. I don't think that equating racism to rich kids being stuck up is the best comparison. And 2, these kids are supposed to be like brothers and sisters to each other. Ayako even says that to Eddie, so I don't think it's controversial to say that it's weird that these 2 kids with a brother-sister dynamic want to date each other. Both of these orphanage chores completely miss the point of the other segments. These parts have essentially nothing to say on the meaning of family, unless you count "it's okay to date your sister" as challenging the meaning of family. There's also a 3rd orphanage story after this, which is both far more tolerable and far less interesting. It retraces the steps of the Shiro bullying story by showing that orphans are actually really nice and not mean evil little babies. Only difference is that this time you play baseball instead of golf. After like an hour of dicking around at the orphanage, some more stuff that really doesn't matter happens, and we finally head off to Kamurocho. I know it sounds like I'm skimming through this part, which I am, because this is the worst part of the game to me. Everything could be cut out and nothing would be lost. Luckily, it's all uphill from here, and the game never sinks to the same level again. Upon going to Kamurocho, we're greeted with a cutscene involving a very muscular Yakuza doing some training. He appears to be very important, having his own secretary and having to cancel a meeting with some businessmen to make it to the one for the Tojo. We're not given much information other than that, and his endorsement of Gatorade. Moving on, we have another guy intimidating the owner of a Chinese restaurant in some interesting ways. After the owner refuses to comply with his demands, he blows the whole place up. And for our final introduction, we go to what remains of the Nishikiyama family. The boss is very loudly doing something to a woman in the other room. His goons pick up the call, which alerts them of the meeting. The boss exits the room and generously rewards his underlings for their hard work. He very obnoxiously outlines his plans for war and gets on the phone with the guy we saw a second ago, named Mine. The war that Kanda, the boss, is talking about is a war of succession for the chairman seat. This last scene is actually kind of chilling to watch, knowing what we do about Mine later in the game, but we'll get there when we get there. I think these are good introductions to the new heads of the Tojo. They definitely don't seem like the greatest heads of a Yakuza syndicate in the world, at least when it comes to Kanda and Hamazaki, the second guy, but it's understandable when you see the tough times that have befell the Tojo. Cutting back to Kiryu and Kamurocho, he witnesses some customers running out of stardust and goes to investigate. Inside, Hasebe, the Nishiki family captain, is attempting to cut a deal with Kazuki and Yuya, the managers of the club. They, of course, refuse, and it starts a boss fight. Hasebe's fight is one of the most forgotten about ones in the game, and I think that's a shame. For one, I really like Hasebe's design. His blue jacket and gold shirt are a unique color combination that really pops, and he's the only character in the series to have cornrows if my memory serves me right. It's a unique hairstyle that I think is underutilized in the series and in media in general. Hasebe's fight is the big fuck you group boss that happens in every game. You know the one. Shimano 2 in Yakuza 1, Teruda/Daijin Kim in 2, Munakaza in 4, Final Kanai in 5, Koshimizu 2 in 6, etc, etc. Funnily enough though, in the game with what many consider to be the worst combat, this one is the most tolerable, and honestly pretty fun. The fact that enemies aren't as aggressive in this game, plus the added help from Kazuki and Yuya, are definitely factors in why this is the case. The group itself isn't that large anyway. You have very few crowd control options in 3 compared to later games, but the defensive enemy AI allows them to be picked off one by one more easily, while the others are distracted by your teammates. Hasebe himself doesn't have the most interesting moveset in the world, at least not until he pulls a sword out of his ass. He does use a copied Kenzan moveset, but it's still a nice change of pace. His defense goes down drastically in this phase, so you can kinda just wail on him. This is the last time we ever see Hasebe, which is a shame. He had a lot of potential. It's sad how much Chapter 4 lost the momentum the game had in Chapters 1 to 3. It's not often that a game's low point is immediately after the beginning exposition, but once again, it picks up from here. Kazuki and Yuya give Kiryu some context on the Nishikiyama family's new rise to power in the city. This will come back up later when we get more information on Kanda, but it's sad to see just how much of a shell of its former self the family has become, with Kanda himself being symbolic of that downfall. Anyway, you're forced to take a very specific route through the city due to the police, which leads you to getting jumped in an alleyway from some men in black. This is a nice surprise boss fight, or at least it would be if the main guy wasn't so aggressive while you're trying to deal with the mooks. That aside, this guy is really fun to fight, and Hidenori Shoji lays down the heat as always with the track Soundstorm. If you have a good memory, you'll remember seeing this guy in the intro cutscene with the Kazuma lookalike. Makes you wonder what this guy's deal is, and serves as a good reward for people with a keen eye. Without saying a word, these guys get the hell out of dodge once you beat them up, which serves as a good way to keep the player wondering just what's up with them. Kiryu heads up to the Kazuma office for a visit with Kashiwagi. Here, the gang gives us a cutscene showing the Tojo meeting, which is a good insight into the personalities of the big three that we were just introduced to. They discuss what to do moving forward due to the chairman's uncertain condition. Kashiwagi and Mine seem to be in agreement in appointing Kiryu as interim chairman, but Hamazaki and especially Kanda disagree. I want to bring up again how Kanda is symbolic of the downfall of the Nishikiyama family. For those unaware, the family was started by Kiryu's oath brother, Nishiki, while he was in prison during the events of Yakuza 1. We've seen this family slowly wilt away from then to now, and now seeing Kanda, this loud, bumbling sex offender as the leader, just goes to show that it needs to be put down. Hamazaki, seemingly egging Kanda on, brings up the potential issues with bringing Kiryu in as chairman, which only makes him more pissed. Majima, who's been there the whole time, leaves, seemingly uninterested in their little playground scuffle. Kiryu and Kashiwagi get to talking for a bit longer before the power cuts out, and we get a very infamous cutscene.
変だな。カムロ町の明かりはついてるみたいだ。
柏木さん、柏木さん。
桐生、この男とつながってるやつを探し出せ。
つながってる。
多分そいつは沖縄のリゾート開発の裏で利権を狙ってる。そいつは登場界
内部の人間ですか？
そいつを探し出せ。いいな。
はい。柏木さん、柏木さん。
As much as I want to talk about this, I don't feel like I can get my full point across about how Kashiwagi's death was handled just yet. And trust me, we will get to that later as well. I never got this whole section where Kiryu has to avoid the police. Do they think he's the one who was in the helicopter? Even if he was, there's no way he would have any blood on him. It doesn't make any sense. Anyways, Kiryu runs into Date, and they go to New Serena. This part is an unfortunate side effect of this game's wonky balance between the Yakuza plotline and the orphanage stuff. Date essentially lays out all the background information you need to know for these three Tojo guys. Because the traditional Yakuza story has to share its runtime with the orphanage, there's basically no way there would have been enough time to discover most of this information naturally. Even with this info dump and the really bad one later, the game still has trouble getting everything it wants into the story. I've already stated how I think that the orphanage stories are a necessary part of the plot, although they could have been cut down, and for some, removed entirely. Even if this were the case, I still think that Yakuza 3 would have needed to be a longer game in general to fit everything. I'm not entirely sure what caused the game to come out in the state that it did. If we look at Yakuza 3 in relation to Ryuga Gotoku Kenzen, we can see that it came out just under a year later. Kenzen itself was a side game intended to get the dev team some experience with the PlayStation 3 before moving on to the next main installment, being Yakuza 3. Kenzen is, at least in my opinion, a technical marvel. Not only is this game stunning to look at, but it is so grandiose in scale compared to any other game in the series. By all accounts, Yakuza 3 is a smaller game than Kenzen, but it turned out a lot sloppier in execution. I know a year between two releases sounds very short, but RGG Studio has had short gaps between releases ever since the studio was made. The gap between Yakuza 1 and 2 was only a single year, and for a more recent example, the gap between Gaiden and Yakuza 8 is only 2 months. It may be because the studio was still in its infancy at the time, being less than 5 years old, but who knows. I'll be wondering how Yakuza 3 ended up the way it did until the day I die. To summarize this scene after that tangent, Kanda is a thug and a sex offender, Mine is a businessman who bribed Kanda to get into the Yakuza, and Hamazaki has ties to the Snake Flower Triad, a Chinese mafia group in Yakuza 1. One of these guys is a traitor to the clan who ordered the attack on Kashiwagi, and you're now tasked with finding out who. First on the checklist is Kanda, but before you get to that, Nikiya tells you he's in Kamurocho now, so you go find him. He's protecting a girl from some Yakuza grunts, who boast that they're in the Nishiki family. You beat them down and get them to point you to Kanda, who's waiting in a love hotel. Nikiya pretends to be gay to get them in, and the two of them confront Kanda, which starts the second long battle of the game. This has to be one of my favorite long battles in the series. It's fairly light on the actual fighting, but the concept of listening in on rooms in a love hotel to find Kanda is hilarious and super fun. It's a super cool way to shake up the gameplay of a regular long battle and almost feels like a mini-game. It's a pretty short long battle, especially if you know what rooms Kanda is going to be in already, because yes, they are the same every time. After finding Kanda 3 times, he runs into the VIP section, and you have to follow him up there. The Kanda boss fight has always seemed to me more like a puzzle than a fight. Kanda is very defensive in his first phase and has knockdown immunity, so it's all about finding the right openings to attack. Some ways I like to do this are either by charging a Lotus Flare Fist first, which bypasses knockdown immunity, or by letting him grab me, and abusing grab release knockdowns. Phase 2 is when Kanda rips this giant stone decoration out of the wall. Do you wait it out until he drops it? Do you do a heat action or bounding throw to get some extra damage? Or do you just stop all of that immediately and do this one specific heat action that skips it entirely? In between these, he might go and pick up a piece of furniture, which requires you to parry. This also acts as an opening and temporarily disables his knockdown immunity. Rinse and repeat a few times, get to the very sexy QTEs, and the fight's over. You figure out that Kanda's too stupid to have been the one that killed Kashiwagi, but he does spill the beans by saying that Hamazaki did it. But first we gotta go check and make sure Majima didn't betray us. You go and find him in Purgatory, an underground area in Kamurocho filled to the brim with places to fulfill any of your desires. You ask him about his involvement in the resort deal, but he refuses to budge. At least, he won't until you fight him. This is probably my favorite Majima fight in the series. The gimmick of this fight is that Majima won't attack you unless you're facing away from him. All of this circling around you're seeing me do has a purpose. If your reaction time's good enough, you can parry or dodge around for a combo. The arena is small and completely lined with walls, which allows for some of the best bounding combos you can do in the game. Overall, just a really fantastic fight. Chapter 8 sees everyone else shift the blame onto Hamazaki. The florist from the last 2 games comes back and gives you some info on the resort deal. But just before he can give some info on the Cosmo lookalike, an emergency erupts in Kamurocho. The Snake Flower Triad has marched on the city and taken Nikiya hostage. Kiryu embarks on yet another long battle to go save him. I'm not gonna beat around the bush. This is an F-tier long battle. It's the worst in the game and one of the worst in the series. Imagine the final long battle of Yakuza 2, but infinitely worse. I swear these enemies block 5 times more than the regular ones. They all have annoying movesets, and you get ganged up on so hard. Whose idea was it to make a section with infinitely respawning enemies with a mini-boss that you have to get to half health? Halfway through, you get a mini-boss that blocks everything, then a chase segment, fight more bad enemies, then fight an even worse mini-boss. Just a fucking awful long battle. I don't know how I made it into the game. You find Nikiya about to get executed, and you have to fight Lau Kalong, the leader of the Snake Flower Triad, who was also in the first Yakuza game. Lau Kalong has a great boss theme, but is the second worst boss in the game. Like his underlings, he blocks absolutely everything, so there's very little you can do against him in his spear phase. Most people recommend doing your full light combo, and then quick stepping around him when he does his retaliation attack. This means basically nothing though, as he gains full super armor, so attacking him from behind during this attack does nothing, and the window to stun him afterwards is practically non-existent. Alternatively, you could spam reverse SST in his direction and it'll hit eventually. It's not the most fun thing in the world, but it works. His unarmed phase is a lot more fair. His attacks are very fast, but it's a lot easier to circle around him. This is easily his best phase. Everything goes to shit again once he pulls out his claws. He gains knockdown immunity because he's in heat mode, and now you can't block his attacks. Have fun learning the tiger drop timings because that's about all you can do. Laukalong's henchmen are about to kill off Rikia when suddenly... the man of the hour comes in and saves the day, but we unfortunately don't get any more answers.
Beautiful eyes. Like I heard from my brother before.
As memed on as that line is in the community, I don't really know what the point of this was other than add to the lookalikes' mystique. At the end of the day, it's nothing to get too riled up about, but it is kinda weird. Still funny though. Chapter 9, aptly named The Plot, is the final chapter where the game packs in plot development way too hard. Next chapter we can finally get back to the good stuff. For now though, we find ourselves back in the main Purgatory office, having saved Rikia. To everyone's surprise, Mine shows up. He presents the head of Kanda as atonement for letting him get out of hand. He also informs Kiryu that Hamazaki is out of the picture, likely having been captured in response to the failure of the Triad's march and quote-unquote death of Laukalong. Mine is a very interesting character with a lot of depth that I feel is overlooked by many. I'm gonna save a full character analysis on Mine for the end of the story analysis because of how much there is to unpack. Many of Yakuza 3's biggest detractors will say that Mine, while being a decent villain, pales in comparison to those who both preceded and succeeded him. I wholeheartedly disagree with this. Mine, to me, is one of the most human characters in the series, even despite the relatively short amount of screen time he gets. Kiryu sends Rikia back to Okinawa, and then receives a call from none other than Minister Ryuzo Tamiya, the politician backing the military base. Tamiya asks for a favor from Kiryu, and the two of them decide to meet in the Diet building, with Date tagging along for good measure. If you're familiar with this game, then you know what time it is. The infamous 30-minute info dump that involves nothing but Kiryu sitting his ass down and talking. I've mentioned before how this game takes some liberties in how it presents its plot, as an unfortunate side effect of having to share the game's runtime with the orphanage like two 8-year-olds with an Xbox. This scene is simply the worst of that compromise. I don't think that a scene like this is bad on paper. It's very likely that a politician as involved in the events of Yakuza 3 like Tamiya would have some crucial information that few others do. Ideally though, this scene is only around 5 minutes. We would get told a few new things, and the rest of the chapter would play out like normal. The rest of the information we would have learned in the final scene we got would be presented in a more natural manner throughout the rest of the game. But of course, this isn't how things ended up in the final product. I know I've blamed the cause of this on the wonky allotment of the game time on the orphanage, and while the orphanage segments do feel overly bloated at points, both in terms of the actual content within them and how much the game focuses on them, it's also a factor of the game just not being long enough in general. I stated before that Yakuza 3 is one of the shortest games in the series, clocking in at 16.5 hours according to How Long to Beat. I'm fairly certain that my original playthrough was even shorter than this, around 14 hours. You definitely feel this short length when playing the game, as some of the chapters, like 1 and 7, can go by in 20 minutes even without skipping cutscenes. None of this is to excuse the hulking mess of plot vomit we have here, but I can at least understand what necessitated its existence in the first place. To run through everything we find out in this scene as briefly as I can, we learn the military expansion bill is all a ruse to draw out an illegal arms dealing group known as Black Monday, named after the real-life stock market crash in 1987 that they and their leader, Andre Richardson, were thought to have caused, at least in this game's universe. The BMD system that was touted as the main appeal of this military expansion does not exist. The Kazuma lookalike is Shintaro Kazuma's twin brother, Joji Kazuma. The reason Kiryu never knew about Joji is because he joined the police force. Back when this was happening, a cop having a brother in the Yakuza would be a death sentence for their career, so they cut essentially all ties with each other. Joji currently works for the CIA. He and Tamiya are good friends, and have been helping each other execute the plan to bring Black Monday to light. Toma, Tamiya's secretary, who we saw back in Chapter 3, left to join Suzuki's cause after finding out the truth of the military expansion bill. It turns out that Mine has actively been backing the resort deal, so Toma will likely tell him everything about the military expansion. This will, in turn, cause Joji to silence him. Tamiya wants us to prevent that from happening at all costs. And it was actually the CIA who ordered the attack on the Kazuma office that resulted in Kashiwagi's quote-unquote death. It was performed because he was trying to put a stop to the resort deal. Tamiya certainly is an interesting character. You expect him just to be a background politician who sits in his office and calls the shots, and in a way, he is that. But you get to actually see what he's all about from this scene. I mentioned how the overarching theme of this series is how good people can be found in the worst of places. Tamiya is a unique example of this because of how the Yakuza series treats the government. The series seldomly directly comments on the government as an institution, but instead alludes to it by examining various political figures throughout the games. Many people with some kind of political power in these games are depicted as corrupt, greedy, selfish, misanthropic, the whole 9 yards. Notable examples are Jingu from Yakuza 1, Munakata from Yakuza 4, Heizo Iwami from Yakuza 6, and Ryo Aoki from Yakuza 7. By painting political figures in this way, the government has consequently become a place in society that people look down upon, but the Yakuza series is aware of this. Tamiya says that he wants Kiryu to save Toma, even despite his defection, because he genuinely wants the best for his country, and doesn't want to see a promising young politician like Toma be snuffed out. Tamiya proves that even in such an evil institution, there can still be good people, just like in the Yakuza. To round out the end of this chapter, Suzuki's men surround the building, and Kiryu needs to go fight his way out of the Dai building. This fight sucks. You get swarmed super hard by guys with weapons, and you're confined to this small circle. The guys on the outside even push you away if you get too close. I'd still take this over the Chapter 8 long battle into Lauka Long True Combo any day of the week though. Just as Kiryu's getting tired, Majima storms in a truck. The two of them escape together, and the chapter ends. Mine shows off his Like a Dragon Infinite Riz, and Kiryu takes a flight back to Okinawa. He gets the Ryudo boys up to speed with everything that's happened, as well as Nakahara, who's finally been discharged from the hospital. Tamiya calls to let Kiryu know that Toma is in a meeting and is safe for now, so we've got time to kill. You can probably guess, but this is just another excuse for more orphanage side quests. The first one involves Taichi seemingly getting hurt after a wrestling match with Mitsuo. The doctor fears that it may be due to abruptly onset asthma, and that he shouldn't wrestle anymore out of fear of another attack. This breaks Taichi's heart, so to cheer him up, Kiryu and Rikia set up a fake wrestling match for him. It turns out afterwards that Taichi only has a mild buckwheat allergy, which was triggered by him eating too much soba. I like this one. It's definitely the best one. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and shows how much Kiryu cares for his kids with a thick coat of that Yakuza brand goofiness. The second one involves Haruka hastily leaving the orphanage, and it appears that she's trying to hide something. Kiryu follows her around town to find that she's been hanging around with some pretty shady thugs. After dinner, she goes out again, and Kiryu follows her. It turns out that the thugs are using her as part of a credit card scam. Once she beat them down, Haruka reveals that she took the job after overhearing a conversation between Nikia and Mikio about some financial issues. It was all a misunderstanding though, as they were talking about how their rent is being raised at the Ryudo office, not at Morning Glory. One part of the story that I never got was how, if Haruka is so concerned about keeping Morning Glory afloat, why would she spend so much of the money she earned to help on a big, expensive meal? Otherwise, this story is fine. I wish it wasn't as long, but it's definitely not the worst of them. The third and final one involves Ayako, who feels underappreciated. She runs away after a few of the kids decide to be huge dicks to her for no reason, as kids do. You have to chase her around town to get her to come back, but at least we get a pretty heartwarming cutscene at the end. This one is similarly just okay. Tamiya gives you a call letting you know that Toma has gotten out of his meeting, and is at immediate risk of assassination. He points you towards a pole dancing bar in Ryukyu as the most likely place that he's headed. Once you get past the 50-second straight of nothing but close-up shots of strippers, accented by a horrendously off-key club song, Kiryu spots Toma sitting, having a good time, and Joji walking up the stairs. Kiryu charges at them in an attempt to defuse the situation, and barely manages to stop Joji from landing a clean shot on Toma. This is my favorite boss fight in the entire series, from both a gameplay and thematic standpoint. Incidentally, it also has my favorite song in the series as well, Lyricism Without Tears. Joji is, of course, another examination on the theme of family. There's a lot to go over here, so sit tight. When media covers the found family trope, it usually explores one of two things. Primarily, how you can choose anyone to be your family beyond blood relation, as long as you share a strong familial bond. And secondarily, how you can reject someone related to you by blood as family if that same bond is not there. These act as two sides of the same coin. Yakuza 3 has already covered both of these in the beginning segment, but instead of retracing those steps, Joji is used as a different interpretation of these two. If the first theme states that family goes beyond blood because you can choose a non-relative to be family, and the second because you can choose a relative to not be family, then this third idea presented by Joji and Kiryu's dynamic asks us a question. In the face of a man who looks, speaks, and acts identically to the one you called your father, what stops you from considering that man your father? Whereas, traditionally, the topic of found family covers how family transcends physical barriers, this dynamic shows how it transcends mental barriers as well. Joji is not Kiryu's dad, not just because he isn't Shintaro, but also because he did not share all of the time and experiences with Kiryu that Shintaro did. The reason that Kiryu can fight Joji without restraint is because he can go past the mental barricade of seeing someone who is physically the same as his father. It ultimately boils down to the same idea of family being the people who you share the strongest bonds with, but it's unique in how it changes the problem but arrives at the same solution, thus reinforcing the idea. One great thing about this fight is how you can view it in two ways that are completely opposite of each other, and get two different but equally valid and thematic readings. If Kiryu does not see Joji as Shintaro, you get what I just said about how family goes beyond mental notions, just as it does blood relation. But if Kiryu does see Joji as Shintaro, the theming of this fight suddenly becomes that of Kiryu moving on from living under Kazuma's shadow. He literally gets to fight a physical manifestation of his dead dad to do this. What I think is most likely though is that both of these readings are correct. Kiryu rejects the idea that Joji is Shintaro by saying that blood doesn't matter, and implying that even though Joji looks like his dad, they don't share the bond that Kiryu and Shintaro did. Despite this, in the back of his mind, Kiryu is subconsciously making the connection between the two of them, which gives the fight the subtext of Kiryu finally moving past and accepting his father's death, and being able to live as his own person. Even if Kiryu already has at this point, this is his time to truly prove it to himself and the audience. I feel like Lyricism Without Tears fits this idea, being this wide-open, freeing track. It's not exactly fitting of a trained CIA hitman, but that's not the point. For those of you who are familiar with this series, what would you say that Daigo's theme is? I feel like most of you would say Farface, his boss track from Yakuza 4. The other option is his boss track from Yakuza 5, but that's not really his theme, is it? It's not. It's the theme of that specific fight between him and Shinada. This same idea applies to Lyricism Without Tears. It's not Joji's theme, it's the theme of the fight between him and Kiryu. And that's why it's not some heavy rock or electronic theme like Soundstorm on the other CIA guy. Its openness is representative of Kiryu overcoming that mental hurdle. On the gameplay side of things, Joji is a stance-based boss, behaving noticeably differently when in and out of heat mode. Outside of heat mode, he's a very dodgy fighter with many fast attacks and fake-outs. Most of the time, he won't attack you unless you try to attack him first. In his heat phase, he becomes super aggressive and gains knockdown immunity. Joji can dynamically change between heat and no heat throughout the fight to keep you on your toes, and I love just how many options you have to deal with him. He's a huge refresher from Lauka Lame in the Circle of Doom. Kiryu defeats Joji, and he swears that he won't go after Toma anymore. This ending bit is another minor instance of the theme of family. While Toma and Tamiya aren't exactly father and son, Tamiya does act as a mentor to Toma, and you'd be surprised at the overlap. Joji wakes up from his beating and explains some of the loose threads to Kiryu. It just so happens that he didn't shoot Nakahara or Daigo. Instead, it was all the doing of his CIA buddy that tagged along with him. He also clues Kiryu into Daigo's whereabouts, Toto Hospital. But before Kiryu can head off to protect him, Taichi storms in with dire news. Mine and the Tamashiro have demolished Morning Glory. Rikiya was injured, Mikiya was barely hanging on to life, and Nakahara was kidnapped. Once again, as much as there is to unpack here, I do want to save my thoughts on Mine until the very end. I want to have all the cards before I start trying to put them in order. To very quickly touch on this last bit with Joji, this scene here has been very controversial for how Joji completely drops his orders from the CIA to kill Toma just because Kiryu beat him. Yes, this isn't very realistic, but in Joji's own words, all that they care about is achieving the proper result. It goes to show Joji's compassion and how, even though he and Shintaro separated long ago, he still has many similarities to his brother. Later that night, Kiryu goes to rescue Nakahara. Rikiya begs to tag along, but Kiryu sternly refuses. Rikiya understandably wants to help save his boss, and at the same time, prove to himself that he's a man, that he can help the people he cares about in the same way that Kiryu does. But Kiryu doesn't see it that way. He doesn't want Rikiya to mindlessly throw his life away. And with that said, he heads off to the bull ring. Tamashiro lured him there as a distraction, to keep Kiryu's attention while Mine makes his way to Tokyo. Nakahara gets thrown into the bull ring to fend for himself, while Tamashiro sicks his boys on Kiryu. But just in time, Rikiya shows up with Saki, having disobeyed Kiryu's words. He alerts Tamashiro that he's called the cops, but this only causes him to set off the bulls. And just when one starts to charge...
Huh? Osho!
Nagara!
It's a lovely little way to come back around to the scene from the beginning of the game. In accepting each other as father and daughter, the relationship has helped both Nakahara and Saki in this time of need. The concern for her dad caused Saki, in a heated moment, to regain her ability to speak. The need to be there for his daughter gives Nakahara the strength to literally grab the bull by the horns and save himself. All of this build-up, unfortunately, leads to the absolute worst boss in the game. It starts with a giant group of guys all with weapons. This part takes way longer than I'd like it to, and just isn't fun. When you beat them all up, you jump into the bull ring and go one-on-one with Tamashiro. For a little bit at least. Gun Tamashiro might be the easiest boss in the game when he's on his own, but dealing with him and a swarm of goons is not a fun experience. He does this like 3 times, and it doesn't get any better. If there's anything to be grateful for though, it's that when he goes into heat mode, he gains this double kick attack. It's very predictable and doesn't actually deal any damage, so it's a pretty free Tiger Drop opening. With Tamashiro defeated, and Crisis, wow that's the chapter title, averted, we get a sweet little reunion between Nakahara and Saki. Kiryu makes the biggest mistake you can in this universe though, and he leaves the gun around a supposedly unconscious villain. Tamashiro makes one last attempt at finishing Kiryu off, but Rikiya steps in the way. Just a few moments too late, Joji comes in and lands a clean headshot. The Rikiya death scene is incredibly divisive within the community because of how Kiryu is full on sobbing over a guy we just met in this game. I do agree that this scene is played up a bit too much, but I think it would be better if more death scenes were like this, if a bit dialed back. I completely understand Kiryu letting it all out like this though. While at this point you've been playing the game for maybe 10 to 12 hours, canonically, Kiryu has known Rikiya for well over a year. In that time, Rikiya has been his friend, has acted as a caretaker for his children, and has basically been part of his family. Beyond that, Rikiya was still young. He's implied to be somewhere around his early to mid-20s, and Kiryu, once again, feels like he has failed to protect someone who needed him. This still doesn't excuse how all Kashiwagi got was a few name drops and a sad face before Kiryu ran off. I understand that he needed to hurry out of the building, but I still fail to see the issue considering the series' tendency to practice time manipulation. Even if I do find myself defending Rikiya's death scene, I don't know how it got more out of Kiryu than the brutal murder of the guy who was basically his uncle. One good thing about this scene though is the great use of a guitar and piano version of Fly, the game's final boss theme. You wouldn't have heard it at this point outside of the intro on international versions of the game, but even then, you likely won't make the connection that this is Fly until repeat playthroughs. And considering the content of this scene, that name has a much more depressing connotation. At last, our final chapter begins with Mine set for takeoff on his way to Todo Hospital. While I will be saving Mine's analysis until the end, I do briefly want to discuss this scene right now. Up until now, we've barely gotten any glimpses past Mine's front that he puts up to most people. This is the scene where he finally lashes out and has his true feelings revealed. This is very much a reaction to trauma, which is a running theme throughout all of Mine's appearances. Keep this in mind as we go through the finale. Kiryu catches a ride on one of the CIA jets, provided by Joji, which is also how he managed to get from Okinawa to Tokyo so quickly. Kiryu says what might be his last goodbye to Haruka, and he heads off to stop Mine. The entire Hakuho clan is there to greet him, so he's not going to get there without a fight. This is the final long battle of the game, and what a finale it is. It starts with a circle of doom like in Chapter 9, but this one is much less bullshit and a lot more fun. These guys really just let you go buck wild. From there, you fight your way up the first few floors of the hospital until you find the Hakuho captain. This guy actually sucks dick, and the only way to really get any damage is to bait an attack and parry. Even then, his moves don't have great tells, but I did find that if you land a guard break, he will always do an attack right after, which is nice. After beating him, he tells you where Daigo is, and then you have to make your way through a long corridor of gun enemies. Gun enemies are unfortunately bugged in the remastered versions of Yakuza 3 and 4 to where they will almost never shoot, which makes this bid very easy, but it's still pretty fun to just grab a gun and shoot everyone. though this also only applies to pistol enemies. Shotgun and machine gun enemies work just fine, so you still have to worry about them. Eventually, you enter the elevator, fight a few more enemies, and make it to Daigo's room. This is an insanely good long battle, a definite S tier, and so is the unique music theme this one has, played all on the Cradle. Upon entering the room, Daigo and Mine are nowhere to be found. The only one in there is the CIA agent you fought in Chapter 5. I know the scene has been memed to death already, but it cracks me up every time how bonkers this guy's inflection and pronunciation is on everything.
If you're looking for Daigo, Mine's taken him up to the roof.
You find yourself fighting him again right in the hospital room, and I hate to say it, but this fight's piss easy. His aggression in the first fight made him very troublesome to deal with since he was in a group, but now that he's solo, it just creates a ton of openings for attack. He goes down easy, but he doesn't seem quite done just yet. Maybe it would have been a little more subtle if his theme didn't keep playing after you beat him for the first time. For this final fight, he pulls out dual pistols and a shotgun. CIA Guy's third fight is often touted as the best gun boss to ever come out of the series. Not that the competition is all that stiff. I do really like this fight though. It's not nearly as brain dead easy as the last one, and it dynamically changes whenever he decides to switch his weapon. He's very comboable, so you can really exploit him if you know what you're doing. But getting that opening isn't always a walk in the park. Switching weapons goes beyond just a simple change in moveset too. Like Tamashiro 1, CIA Guy is a stance change boss, but instead of changing once when he goes into heat mode, he can change whenever throughout the fight. His pistol phase is a more well-rounded and speedy phase. He makes use of a lot of flips and dodges to circle around, but his attacks often have long wind-up animations that leave him very open. His shotgun phase drastically decreases his defense, completely removing his ability to block and limiting his pool of dodges to a predictable side roll. To shore up this weakness, his attacks are much faster and more potent, but if you can make it in, you have very little to worry about. Overall, a very solid penultimate boss. Kurohyou finally reaches the roof of Todo Hospital, and sees Mine next to a still comatose Daigo. I think it's finally time to discuss Mine and just why I think he's such a genius villain. Mine, like Kurohyou, was an orphan, but instead of receiving the kind of life that Kurohyou had, he was casted to the wayside. While Kurohyou had someone he looked up to as a father, and plenty of friends who would support him in his youth, Mine had nothing. Not only did he witness his own father's death, but he was constantly bullied by the other kids around him. This lack of love and support from anyone gave him a narrow and cynical view of life. He joined the Yakuza in an effort to find some kind of meaningful connection, and was lucky enough to find one with Daigo. Daigo treated him like an equal. He was the first person to ever give him any of the respect that he deserved. And now that Daigo is balancing on the edge of life and death, Mine feels lost again, and sees killing Daigo as his own twisted form of mercy. The same idea applies to when he bulldozed the orphanage. As extreme and fucked up as it is, to him, he's doing them all a favor, because he's projecting his experiences onto all orphans. It's an unfortunate truth that childhood trauma can cause people to grow up with warped views of the world. Challenging these views is very difficult due to how deep-rooted they can be, but no matter how hard they can be hammered in, Kurohyou is going to deal with them the only way he knows how. Mine is the most badass final boss in the entire series. As divisive as Yakuza 3 is, almost everyone agrees that this fight is as good as it gets. Mine had style switching 6 years before that even became a thing. Mine is an absolutely electrifying boss that never slows down. In his first phase, he's fairly defensive and likes to use a lot of fast moves to keep you out. The key is to keep your distance and bait his dodge attack. Parrying it gives you a good opening to do whatever you want. His second phase is his orange heat phase, where he gains a new moveset and knockdown immunity. This phase is characterized by large, sweeping strikes, which are just as fast as any of his other moves. These attacks have long animations though, which leaves Mine open. Alternatively, you can bait this dodging punch flurry that he does, and parry. Mine's red heat phase is his most dangerous. He gains full super armor and becomes hyper aggressive. Your best bet is to run away because Mine does not fuck around in this phase. However, if you're feeling ballsy, you can try and hit a parry on one of his attacks. Don't expect to get much off of it though. Finally, Mine's purple heat phase returns him to his phase 1 moveset. He still has knockdown immunity like an orange heat, and he also has a healing move that can be parried with good timing or interrupted with a heat move or bounding throw after it starts. He'll cycle through these modes throughout his fight to make sure that you never get too comfy. Mine is a truly outstanding boss that you need to fight for yourself to fully understand the genius of. But like all bosses, the fight has to end at some point.
Magita. のか。俺が。
畑瀬です。会長、どうかされたんですか？
大丈夫だ。
会長、私どうしたらよいか。
お前だけだ。俺のこと。
私だけでは判断できず、もうどうしたらよいか。例のドバイの案件の株、時価の10倍での申し込みがありました。今回の話を聞いた欧米。
This ending scene is vital for me to wrap up my thoughts on Mine. It's not often that you have a game that has a main theme that is bashed into your head in so many different ways throughout its runtime, only for the final boss to have it only as a secondary theme. Mine isn't directly tied to the theme of challenging the meaning of family. This idea is still present, with him finding his only true bond with Daigo, and subsequently treating him with the same love and respect as he would a member of his family. But it isn't what stands out to me as the main point of the scene. Mine's strongest theme, to me, is about overcoming childhood and familial trauma. Upon Mine's defeat, he says that, despite him losing everything in this moment, he feels at peace. He realizes that his wealth, the only thing he has left, is meaningless. That only true human connection can make him happy in life. He acknowledged this before the fight, but it took a reality check from Kurohyou for him to internalize it. When he picks up the call from his secretary, she expresses her worry for him. He sees this as an opportunity to establish a real, tangible bond for the first time since Daigo. But whether it's a declaration of love, or simply a thanks for being by his side, he's quickly brought back down to earth. His secretary is just as caught up in the accruement of wealth as he was, and with the press of a button, he proves to Kurohyou and the player that he doesn't need it anymore. Money had always been an unhealthy coping mechanism for him. It was a way for him to believe that he had worth, because growing up, everyone around him told him he had none. The only exception was his father, but when he died, he was truly alone. When Daigo got shot, Mine was afraid that he was going to lose the only thing that gave him real meaning in life, which is what set him on his warpath for the chairman spot. And now, getting beaten by Kurohyou has made him realize that his way of coping with his trauma was unhealthy and destructive for both him and the people around him. The reason he is so calm despite losing it all is because he now has an unclouded view of life and a fresh start with which to exercise it. In the middle of this, the CIA agent, who Mine tells us is actually Black Monday's leader, Andre Richardson, walks up to the roof. In the nick of time, Daigo awakes from his coma and shoots him and his boys with Mine's gun. This isn't quite enough to stop him though, so in a last-ditch effort, Mine charges at Richardson, grabs hold of him, and steps towards the edge of the roof. Unfortunately, with his newfound clarity, he now has to deal with the weight of his actions coming down on him all at once. Mine thinks that the only way to atone for his sins is with his death, and despite the pleading of Kurohyou and Daigo, he jumps, taking Richardson down with him. And after a brief moment of silence, Joji comes in with a rescue helicopter and takes Kurohyou and Daigo to safety. After a short ending scene which kinda sucks and falls pretty flat actually, the credits roll. It's revealed that Kurohyou's fine, so it doesn't matter anyway, and the game ends. There's one final thing to cover before concluding this section, however, one which I've alluded to a few times already. It's how the most recent games in the series, Yakuza 7, aka Yakuza Like a Dragon, and Yakuza 8, aka Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, have seemingly been trying to erase the events of Yakuza 3, particularly when it comes to character deaths. The three examples of this are Kashiwagi, Lau Kalong, and Richardson/Mine. Kashiwagi, apparently having survived being fucking shredded by a minigun, is the owner of the Survive Bar, which serves as a hub of sorts for the party in 7. Lau Kalong, surviving a clean shot to the head, now serves as a weapons dealer and summon in Yakuza 7, under the moniker of Chow Kalong. And finally, Richardson is the owner of Revolve Bar, which appears in Yakuza 8. Considering that Richardson somehow survived a fall from a 40-story building, there's a chance that Mine also survived. As a whole, I'm not too concerned about these retcons. Kashiwagi's death was never given the weight that it deserved, so I'm actually kinda glad that he ended up living. I really couldn't give a damn about whether or not Lau Kalong lives or dies, and I'm actually really excited to see what they do with Mine if he ends up being brought back. One point of contention with the possible retcon of Mine's death is that it would make his sacrifice meaningless. I disagree with this. The idea behind this is that Mine gave his life in order to atone for what he did. But if he didn't actually die, then what's the point? I understand where people are coming from with this line of thinking, but it's still misguided. It's not the outcome of the action that matters, but instead the intent behind it. Mine jumped off the hospital fully expecting to die for the sake of saving Kiryu and Daigo. Whether or not he actually dies is irrelevant, as either way, the intent behind the action was to sacrifice himself to help the people he cares about. Talking about this may be pointless because Mine still might be dead even with all the hints telling us that he might not be, but no matter what, I'm still excited to see what the future holds for this character and this series. And well, that's Yakuza 3. As is hopefully obvious from the analysis, I really love this game, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows. This game has a lot of issues, like its wonky combat and over-reliance on the orphanage, though I do think these issues are overblown by some people. The plot and themes are absolutely fantastic in the first and last 3 chapters of the game, but the middle section, while still enjoyable, leaves much to be desired. When this game is on though, it's on, having some of the best gameplay and theming in the series. In my opinion, all of the good aspects of this game vastly outweigh the bad, and that's due in no small part to how much I can connect with it. I've already stated how this game has helped me with my conflicting feelings with my father, but I love how this game goes a step beyond that and touches on the trauma you can be left with from dealing with family like that. I love Mine so much because of how eloquently and maturely he represents and conveys how familial trauma can affect your relationships with others as you grow older. It leaves you with a yearning for that kind of connection, but no real means with which to attain it, leading you to push others away out of fear of the same outcome. Most importantly though, Mine proves that no matter how bad it gets and how much it affects you, you are not defined by your past experiences. You can always bounce back and turn into someone that you can be proud of. For a game from 2009, this kind of messaging on trauma and mental health is unprecedented and paints the game as being way ahead of its time. One last thing, a small detail that gets overlooked about Mine's fight is the ending. Once you drain all of Mine's health, he tries to throw one last punch, but in his exhaustion, he misses, and his punch instead turns into a hug before he falls to the ground, defeated. Not only does Mine gain a new perspective on his life from fighting with Kiryu, but this unexpected hug, without words, brilliantly shows how grateful he is to Kiryu. The tragedy of all of this is that many people won't bother to sift through the bad parts to get to the good. Video games, as an art form, are incredibly complex. Take painting, for example. To make a good painting, all that you need is a good idea, good messages behind that idea, and the skill and resources to put that idea down on the canvas. Alternatively, think of writing a book. All you need is the idea, the themes, and the time to flesh it out into a book. This is not to say that making a good painting or writing a good book is easy. It certainly isn't. The point I'm trying to make is that, removed from the amount of skill and effort that it actually takes to create a painting or a book, the basic concept of what you need to do is fairly straightforward. On the other hand, making a video game, especially one of the caliber of Yakuza 3, requires so many different skill sets and is an incredibly convoluted task. Books and paintings are often made by one single person, but because of how multifaceted games are, they are often made by teams of dozens or even hundreds of people, like coders, modelers, writers, artists, musicians, voice actors, etc. Having a lot of moving parts to a piece of art like a video game can also mean that there are a lot of different places in which things can go wrong. In Yakuza 3's case, the combat and some parts of the story suffered in some areas, but I think that defining a game by its rough edges is disingenuous. Approaching Yakuza 3 from a non-emotional angle is to experience the game in a way that it was not intended. My own connection with this game has helped me see that. I love that my own experiences have allowed me to enjoy this game to a higher degree than other people have. Even if you don't share them, I still highly recommend playing Yakuza 3 and keeping what I've said in mind. You might not find the same resonance with it that I do, but you at least won't end up with a review like this. And that's my Yakuza 3 analysis. Let me know if you'd like to see me cover some of the other games, though I might not exactly have the same amount to say about those. But either way, not going to keep this intro very long. Hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.